In Stalin's state, you could lose everything for a single word, for a neighbor's denunciation, for a careless conversation, for contact with a foreigner, for being in German captivity. Sometimes suspicion alone was enough, but terror does not operate on its own. It needs people who compile lists, who initiate investigations, who sign interrogation protocols, who decide that someone is an enemy of the state or an enemy of Stalin. One of those people was Viktor Abakumov, head of SMERSH, the Red Army's military counterintelligence, later Minister of State Security of the Soviet Union, a man who found himself very close to the center of Stalinist power. He was not Stalin's only executioner. There were many such men. But his career shows something particular. In the span of a dozen or so years, he rose from a low rank in the security apparatus to one of the most powerful positions in the Soviet Union. And then, from minister, general, and head of the secret police to a prisoner awaiting death. In 1951, the apparatus he had served for years turned against him. Stalin died on March 5, 1953. Abakumov survived him by about 21 months. He was executed by firing squad on December 19, 1954. This is the story of Stalin's man, consumed by his own system. Viktor Semyonovich Abakumov was born in Moscow in 1908 in a working-class family. He did not come from an elite background. He was not a man of great education or an ideologue on the scale of the most important party theorists. His strength lay in a different quality. He knew how to navigate a system that rewarded loyalty, ambition, and ruthlessness. In his youth, he served in the Red Army. Later, he was active in the Komsomol. In the early 1930s, he joined the OGPU, the Soviet political police, predecessor of the NKVD. This was the moment his career began to accelerate. In 1934, the OGPU was incorporated into the newly formed NKVD. Abakumov worked within the security apparatus, including in areas related to the Gulag system. He did not yet belong to the tight leadership of the terror. He was not Yagoda, Yezhov, or Beria. But he was gaining experience in an institution whose basic task was protecting power through fear. The years 1937 to 1938, the period of the Great Terror, were for the NKVD a time of mass arrests, deportations, and executions. Millions of people came under repression. Hundreds of thousands were shot. Abakumov was not yet one of the main architects of these purges, but he was a functionary of the system that carried them out, and a man who gained successive promotions along the way. In the Stalinist state, brutality was not always a flaw. Often it was a professional qualification. He entered the security apparatus as a relatively low-ranking functionary. A dozen years later, he was to head services of enormous power. This path, from the OGPU through the NKVD to the highest positions, shows the scale of his ambition. The real breakthrough came during the German-Soviet War. In April 1943, Abakumov took charge of the main directorate of counterintelligence SMERSH under the People's Commissariat for Defense of the USSR. The name SMERSH was an abbreviation of the Russian Smert Spionam, death to spies. Officially, the organization's task was to detect German agents, saboteurs, and traitors within the Red Army. And indeed, SMERSH was military counterintelligence. It should not be presented simply as another NKVD cell. It was a special structure operating under the Soviet Union's military leadership. But its role extended far beyond classical counterintelligence operations. SMERSH controlled soldiers, conducted interrogations, pursued deserters, and examined the loyalty of those who had fallen into German captivity. In Stalinist thinking, a prisoner of war was not automatically a victim of war. He could be suspected. Because if he had survived captivity, then, according to the paranoid logic of the system, he might have collaborated with the enemy. SMERSH also participated in filtration operations. People returning from captivity, those suspected of collaborating with the Germans, and those deemed potential threats to the state were screened. This did not mean that everyone interrogated was sentenced, but the mere fact of falling into such a system could determine a person's fate. Abakumov headed SMERSH until 1946. He was simultaneously a very high-ranking military functionary, and a man who had gained Stalin's direct trust. This was when his position was shaped. Not as an ordinary political policeman, but as the man for the most sensitive affairs of state, army, and internal security. For Polish history, Abakumov's name has a particularly dark significance. In the summer of 1945, the war in Europe had formally ended. Poland was to be liberated from German occupation. But in the northeastern territories of the country, another hunt was underway. Soviet services, the military, and supporting communist structures launched a major operation against the Polish independence underground in the area of the Augustów primeval forest and its surroundings. Today we know it as the Augustów Roundup, Obława Augustowska. On July 21, 1945, Abakumov sent a report to Lavrenti Beria. He informed that 7,049 people had been detained. After interrogations, referred to in documents as filtration, 5,115 people were released. But hundreds of others never returned home. Documents indicate that 592 Poles were selected for liquidation. All these persons disappeared, and according to IPN findings, they were murdered in an unestablished location. To this day, we do not know the full course of this crime or the burial place of the victims. We also do not know all the names of the people who disappeared after the Soviet operation. Due to the scale of the crime and the mystery surrounding the fate of the murdered, the Augustów Roundup is sometimes referred to as the Little Cotton. In this story, Abakumov was not a casual observer. He was directly involved in the apparatus that carried out the Augustów Roundup, and his own report to Beria is one of the key documents concerning the fate of its victims. After the war, Abakumov rose even higher. In 1946, he became Minister of State Security of the USSR, head of the MGB. This was one of the most powerful institutions in the state. The MGB conducted political investigations, surveilled citizens, monitored foreigners, controlled public life, and tracked real or imagined enemies. In Stalin's state, state security did not mean the security of people. It meant the security of power. One of the most high-profile cases of this period was the so-called Leningrad Affair. After the death of Andrei Zhdanov in 1948, tensions grew around the Leningrad leadership. Stalin increasingly viewed the party officials associated with the city with suspicion, and the rivalry within the party elite took an ever sharper form. Between 1948 and 1950, a purge was carried out. High-ranking party officials were accused of treason, separatism, anti-party activity, and economic abuses. Many charges were false or deliberately fabricated. People lost their positions, were sent to prisons and gulags. Some were executed. Abakumov and the MGB under him played a significant role in conducting this affair. It was his apparatus that gathered evidence, conducted investigations, and built prosecutions. A few years later, the Leningrad Affair returned. This time not as a tool of his power, but as one of the reasons for his downfall. In the last years of his life, Stalin was becoming increasingly suspicious. He saw conspiracies in the party, in the army, in the services, among doctors, even among people who had carried out his orders for years. In this atmosphere, Abakumov began to lose ground. One of the key figures in his downfall was Mikhail Ryumin, an MGB functionary who turned against his own superior. Ryumin accused Abakumov of hiding hostile agents and failing to uncover an alleged conspiracy of Kremlin doctors. This thread later became part of the so-called Doctors' Plot, an anti-Semitic campaign based on the false claim that a group of doctors planned to assassinate Soviet leaders. Abakumov and part of his circle were not convinced by Ryumin's version. But in Stalin's system, it did not matter who was right. What mattered was whether the accusation would reach Stalin, and whether it fit his current fears. It did. In July 1951, Abakumov was removed from his position as minister. He was then arrested. He was sent to Lefortovo prison. The man who for years had power over political investigations himself became the subject of an investigation. He was not an ordinary victim of terror. He was a high-ranking functionary entangled in a power struggle within the security apparatus. But the mechanism of suspicion, accusations, and political settlements that he had helped set in motion for years was now turned against him. On March 5, 1953, Stalin died. For the Soviet Union, this was the end of an era. It did not mean an immediate end to repression, but it began a struggle for power and a gradual departure from the most extreme methods of late Stalinism. The doctors' plot was annulled. The arrested doctors were released and cleared of charges. Lavrenti Beria, until then a giant of the security apparatus, was himself arrested, tried, and executed. One might have thought Abakumov would regain his freedom. He did not. He was no longer needed as a minister. He was needed as an accused. The new leadership of the Soviet Union wanted to distance itself from some of the crimes of the Stalinist era. At the same time, it could not and did not want to undermine the entire system, which for decades had been based on repression. Therefore, it was easier to point to specific individuals as guilty of abuses. Abakumov was ideal for this role. He was a hated functionary. He had SMERSH, the MGB apparatus, the Augustów Roundup, the Leningrad Affair, and numerous political investigations behind him. And above all, he no longer had political protection. In December 1954, Abakumov stood before an itinerant panel of the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court of the USSR in Leningrad. The trial was closed. The charges included, among other things, fabricating political cases, abusing power, and his role in the Leningrad Affair. What a few years earlier had been action in line with the Kremlin's interest was now presented as the criminal activity of Abakumov and his associates. This did not mean he was innocent. He was responsible for the operation of the terror apparatus. But the trial itself was not a neutral act of justice. It was a political settlement of a man whom the system had first elevated, then discarded. On December 19, 1954, Abakumov and 3 of his former associates were sentenced to death. The sentence was carried out the same day. Viktor Abakumov was 46 years old. Viktor Abakumov was not an innocent victim. He was one of the men who for years carried out the politics of terror. He headed SMERSH. He led the MGB. He was directly involved in the apparatus that conducted the Augustów Roundup, and his own report to Beria is one of the key documents concerning the fate of its victims. He was also an important executor of the repressions related to the Leningrad Affair. But his fate shows the mechanism of how a dictatorship works. In Stalin's system, merits did not guarantee security, position did not protect, and loyalty to the leader lasted only until the leader, or his successors, stopped needing it. Abakumov went the path from OGPU functionary, through the NKVD and SMERSH, to the position of Minister of State Security. Then he became a prisoner, and in the end, a convict. Stalin's man ended up against a wall, not because he opposed the system, but because the system he had served for years decided it was time to consume him as well.